How are bold ideas born and which ones survive to eventually shake up the status quo? We'll hear straight from our industry's greatest visionaries who are making waves and learn how they turned their dreams into disruptive reality. This is From Dreamers to Disruptors, a podcast powered by Medidata. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of our podcast, From Dreamers to Disruptors. I'm Anthony Costello, CEO of Medidata, and very excited to have Brad O'Connor here today, CEO of Cogstate. Brad, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
We've got a ton of content to get into today. I know, just for the record, Medidata and Cogstate are partners, working really closely on the CNS space and doing a lot of great projects together to try to help our customers with a combination of Medidata technology and Cogstate's innovative technology. But today I really want to focus on you and the story behind Cogstate because I think it fits our podcast model really nicely as a story of a real dream that you started a long time ago, and I want you to tell our audience about that, but has really become a disruption, not only as an organization, but in a field of research that itself has become quite disruptive and has really grown a lot over the years.
Yeah.
So maybe before we dive into all of that, can you just tell us a little bit about who is Brad O'Connor? How did you get to Cogstate? How did you help form the company? And talk a little bit about the origin story there.
Yeah, for sure. So as listeners will understand from the accent, I'm Australian. So born in Australia, continue to live in Australia, although I spend a lot of time in the United States. I'm here most months, and most of our people are here, and so most of our business is here. But started at Cogstate over 20 years ago now. So I was 17, obviously, as anyone watching can tell. It started 20 years ago, and really by accident. So I've got a background in finance. I worked at Coopers & Lybrand, as it was in the day, now PricewaterhouseCoopers, which dates me, and came into Cogstate, as I say, really by accident. I was doing some consulting work. I was working on the sale of the Australian arm of the US business. That sale was coming to a conclusion. I rang a friend who was a fund manager in Melbourne, who invested in biotech companies. And just with the idea of just asking me, do you need any of your portfolio companies need a little bit of help, tax structuring, things like that? And he said, well, we've got this thing we've just funded. They have no internal accounting function. Like there's a suburban accountant who's paying wages and doing things like that. Would you be interested in going in for like 12 weeks to set up accounts receivable, accounts payable, wages, things like that? And I said, well, it's not really what I do. My background's tax. It's not really setting up accounting functions. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'll give it a try. It can't be that hard.
So basically you were a temp employee.
I was a temp employee. Yeah. There's no one would have employed me for that role in any full-time capacity. If you'd run any kind of, interview process, there's no way they would have hired me. And so I went in. So that was April of 2004. And it was fascinating. I found the whole thing fascinating. It was, I came from saving rich people from paying taxes. I joke it's like the anti-Robin Hood. I used to take from the poor and give to the rich. It was a really noble profession. And I came into Cogstate, and I'd never seen anything like it. I'd never been involved in any kind of science activity, certainly no kind of science business. And everyone was so passionate about what they did. The original investment premise of Cogstate was that you've got this aging population, this increasing incidence of Alzheimer's disease, and the doctors need better tools to be able to measure cognition so they can determine if someone is changing, and whether there's a treatment for those people. And that's a much more compelling reason to get up in the morning than saving rich people from paying tax. But it was 15 people in a in this tiny office in Melbourne. It was, some really smart people started it. So there was, neurologists and neuropsychologists and, one of the founders who was a neurologist was also a part-time, like he taught himself coding. And I don't know if everyone knows anything about part-time coders, you can imagine what the original source code was like. But super smart people with really good ideas. And it still underpins, a lot of what we do today. Cogstate. So yeah, I just found the whole thing fascinating. I went full time as a CFO. I think it was around October of 2004. But we'd listed, and Australia's got this weird thing where, and I think Canada does a little bit as well, where you get these little mining companies. Someone finds a tenement and they mark it out, and they want to raise money, and so they list on the stock exchange in Australia, and so then the biotechs, and not that we're a biotech in any way, but that sort of healthcare industry had a similar thing, that rather than VC money, you'd essentially have this public market VC. So they'd listed before I started. So they didn't have an accounting function when they listed, which is just
And
amazing.
15 people.
15
Still
people.
public.
Yeah. They raised $7 million on a pre-money valuation of 10. That was in the February. I started in April. And I think the market cap had dropped to like 5 or 6 by the time I started. And we were sort of running out of money. So in December of 2005, so, a sort of year or so later, they asked me to take over as CEO, but it was like the worst, it was the worst job in the world, because, this business is just losing money. It has no market cap. There's no way there's going to be follow-up funding for it. And at that stage, we were trying to sell this technology to primary care doctors. But again, with 15 people and no sales force and no salespeople. And so, but what we did have was some interest from pharma companies who were interested in understanding better ways to measure cognition in their clinical trials. And so what we did was we essentially pivoted from everything that we'd started with, and moved to trying to put that technology into clinical trials.
So the company wasn't started with the idea that you would do clinical research. What was the original idea behind forming the company, and was it a unique concept at that time, or were there other companies doing this already?
No, it was unique, but it was the idea that we would put technology in the hand of doctors that would enable them to measure cognitions, because a primary care doctor doesn't generally have experience with, seeing an Alzheimer's disease patient or someone who's worried about their memory. They're not experienced with conducting cognitive assessments, and they just don't have the time in the context of a standard consultation. And so the idea was we'd give them some tech that would, undertake that assessment for them. And so the doctor would be left looking at the data. And the data is, am I normal? And have I changed? So compare you to age-matched peers to determine, whether you're normal, and then serial assessment to determine whether you're changing. And that's still, a really, really valid construct.
Okay, so you made this pivot into research trials because, like a lot of startups, most startups aren't already listed on the stock exchange, but most startups who are hoping to become listed one day make a couple of pivots along the way to follow the market. Sounds like that's what you did.
Yeah, we're the classic solution looking for a problem.
Yeah, exactly. And so, what was the pharma question that? How is it that pharma brought you guys in and showed the interest that caused the pivot?
So the difficult thing in clinical drug trials in central nervous system disease and the measurement of cognition in that is that you're trying to do a standardized assessment across 20 countries, 30 languages, 100 different clinicians administering the test. And a lot of those assessments are semi-structured. They're not all, you ask this exact question and you write down the answer. And So they're semi-structured, and that means that that you get variability in terms of how the clinician's conducting the assessment. And what that does is just throw error into your data, right? And so our idea was that by using using the software to assess cognition, it puts more structure around that assessment, and we could keep the stimuli the same in every location. So we didn't. They were largely not language based, and they were culturally neutral. So we used playing cards in a lot of the original assessments. So a paradigm that was well understood in different languages, in different cultures. You didn't have to translate anything. And so the idea is that the only thing that changes is whether the patient's on placebo or they're on drug, right? We want to keep everything else the same. And so if we can have this more standardized assessment, that that we can reduce error in the trial. And, so that was an interesting concept for a couple of pharma companies. So we originally worked with Pfizer, which is how we ended up in New Haven, Connecticut, which is our head office or our largest office, because Pfizer got sick of having to deal with these people in Australia and the time zone difference. And they said, if we gave you some money, would you start an office in the US? And in that stage, we had $180,000 of revenue or something, and they offered to give us, I think it was $100,000. I said, well, you give us $100,000, we'll basically do anything. I mean, you nearly bought the company for that. And they said, well, they were in Groton, Connecticut. And they said, but we want you in Connecticut. And we'd been dealing with the Child Study Center at Yale. And, New Haven seemed on the train line halfway between New York and Boston. And that was about as much thought as went into it.
And playing cards.
Playing cards, yeah.
So how did it work?
So the idea is the stimuli would stay the same. And then by changing the question you're asking, you would measure different aspects of cognition. So I'm going to run through a deck of cards. 8 of them are going to repeat as we go through this. I want you to remember the ones that repeat, and then everything's a yes or no answer. So have you seen this? Yes or no? Is this card the same as the one you saw just immediately before? That's a 1 back. So a standard construct of a neuropsych assessment, but just with a different stimuli set. Mm-hmm. We can measure reaction time. As the card flips over, we want you to hit yes. Right? The reaction time tests became harder when everything moved to the cloud and everything went to a touch screen. It was much easier when we were programming in C+ and we could access the processor, and we could get quite accurate reaction time. So tests had to develop over the years. But the construct of what we do is still very similar.
Yeah, but you've turned a lot of these tests now into apps.
Yeah.
Right. Like
yeah.
Technology that's used at the sites during visits, or even some things that patients could potentially use on their own. Can you talk a little bit about that evolution? Like, how did you move into the world of modern apps and create these validated instruments that I think have been now used repetitively on lots of different types of studies?
Yeah, and I think the validation part was really important. So we've got now over 500 published papers supporting the use of Cogstate technology in different drug classes, in different patient indications, things like that. So one of the real challenges as technology develops is making sure that in producing new versions of our assessment, we don't break the validation. So the tests have to operate in basically the same way, or we have to go back and do the validation work again. And so that's been one of the real challenges. But yeah, like every software company, there's continual updates to, moving to web-based, moving to app-based, wanting to be able to deliver the same assessments no matter what device we're using it. So we can do it on a laptop, we can do it on a tablet, we can do it on a phone. Moving to voice-based assessments, right? So we have a list learning test. So that's a standard construct of a neuropsychological test. So I'm going to read you a list of 12 words. I want you to remember them, and I'm going to ask you to repeat as many as you can, right? So a really standard test. We've got our own version of that. And then what we did was develop a phone-based version of that, where your digital assistant on the phone will read you the words. You repeat as many as you can remember. The phone stores that information, and we give you a score. So it's all been, there's nothing new in terms of the design of these tests that we've created. The constructs are well established, and that's been the really critical thing, is taking those established constructs but saying, if I was redesigning this with the most up-to-date technology, how would I do that to reduce error? Because everything we do is about reducing error.
Yeah. And so I want to get into AI and kind of how this takes the next leap forward in terms of technology. But maybe just before we go there, if you just take a step back and imagine someone in the audience who understands the CNS space, but
Yep.
maybe doesn't understand completely how the Cogstate business fits in.
Yeah.
It's in some ways it's a heavy technology business, as you've just described, with these apps and various ways of measuring the analytics around the apps, which then in turn tells you whether a patient is stabilizing or declining and what have you. But it's also a fairly heavy
Yeah.
services business with a lot of manual reading and
Hmm.
interpretation of the tests, right? So
Yeah.
can you explain kind of how does that piece work? And I know Cogstate works with a lot of raters
Hmm.
that are integral to the process, but there's redundancy built into that process and so on. So how does that um, partner maybe with the technology in order to make a whole business case or a whole business value?
Yeah. So the thing for us was, as we got into this clinical trials business, and and again, like a lot of startups, we didn't know what we were doing when we got into clinical trials, and then and then over, if you have enough runway, right? If you can produce enough revenue, and you can, and you've got access to capital, and you can keep the if you can keep the lights on, over the years, you just learn things, and I think there's almost an advantage in coming in as an outsider to some of these things, because you look at some things, you just go, "This is dumb. Why do we do it like this? This makes no sense. There's got to be a better way of doing it." And so we really pivoted from that original thing of, we've got these digital assessments, to thinking about digital disruption in terms of endpoint data quality. So the original idea was the tests will provide better data quality because they're less subjective.
Hmm.
Right? But the principle of taking technology and say, can we disrupt where there is where there's error and there's room for error, you can apply across a whole range of things. So we we wanted to not just sell our test, but we wanted to support the other measures of cognition that would go into a trial. So if you're running an Alzheimer's disease trial, you might have, you'll have multiple measures of cognition in that trial. You won't be relying on one. So certainly your primary endpoint in Alzheimer's disease trial, it might be something like the CDR sum of boxes or something like that. Right. So it's a standard neuropsych assessment. And this is where we've been able to partner with Medidata in terms of using the ECOA functionality that the Medidata has, in terms of, at least recording the output from that clinician assessment. But that's a doctor sitting in front of a patient, right, asking questions, and then recording on the Medidata device the outcome of those questions. Right? But what happens then is, and so then we've got to make sure, we're back to the problem we started with earlier, where we said that there's, you know, 20 countries, 30 languages, 100 doctors, conducting these assessments. And we want to make sure they're all doing it in the same way, right? So the first thing we do is we do a training and certification process to make sure all the doctors know exactly. We know you know this test, but we want you to do it like this for this trial, right? And everyone's going to do it like this. So you got to. So we built, learning management systems, and and online training courses, so we can take people through that certification process. And then we need to make sure that there's a gating system in our ECOA thing, so that only people who are certified can get in and conduct the assessments, right? So we want to, because we want to control that. Right. Then, we've done the assessment. The question is, well, how do you know that that doctor has done it the right way? Right. So then we have, what we call central monitoring. So we have a group of neuropsychologists who can, in local language, can watch and listen to that recording and determine whether that doctor made any mistakes. Right. The problem with that, of course, is that's really labor intensive and really costly. So if you're doing a CDR, it might take you 45 minutes or an hour to conduct that assessment. and the doctor is quite an expensive resource, we're giving that to another expensive resource to watch the first doctor conduct the assessment
As a validation.
as a validation to work out whether there's error. And then if we find error, we might give it to a third doctor to determine, act as a tiebreaker to determine which one was right. So the cost of this just mounts and mounts and mounts. But it's, if, again, just to focus on Alzheimer's disease, if cognition's your primary endpoint, you want to make sure, at least in that, that primary endpoint, that there's as little error as possible. So our job's really just reducing error in trials. So it's reducing error bars, and we reduce error, we increase signal strength. And so that's at the end of the day, that's what we sell to pharmaceutical companies, whether that's better assessments in the form of digital assessments, better training programs to make sure everyone's aligned about how we're conducting this, or the identification of error that's occurred, and then the remediation of that doctor to say, this is what you did wrong, let's not do that again.
So fast forward 20 years, Cogstate's been involved in a lot of studies, a lot of new innovation. The Alzheimer's space has had some big wins in the last couple of years. I know you've been central to many of those.
Yeah, we were really proud to have supported all of Eli Lilly's, the whole program from soup to nuts for the donanemab drug, which has just been approved, in a handful of countries, and it's, the second approved treatment of Alzheimer's disease, a disease modifying treatment for Alzheimer's disease. So, that's been a really big validation for us, because we're still quite a small company. We're 160 people around the globe. We've got a network of hundreds of clinicians, neuropsychologists who also work with us in a consulting capacity, but still a relatively small team. So to have successfully run that global phase 3 program, is a real validation for us.
Yeah. So, we've talked a little bit now about the pharma side, which really was after the pivot that you mentioned earlier. The name of the podcast is From Dreamers to Disruptors. Obviously, we're trying to get at interesting guests that have these dreams that might seem a little crazy in the beginning, but then become the disruption. I know for you, the original dream was to bring this kind of to regular clinical practice.
Yeah.
And so can you talk a little bit more about where that goes in the future? Because although your main customer base has been pharma, I know when you and I talk about this, offline, we still think that these kinds of cognitive assessment tests should be as commonplace as, many other tests, like a cholesterol test or a blood pressure test.
Or even easier, as easy as monitoring your steps or your sleep, your Aura ring or whatever it is you're using for that digital monitoring. I think it's really interesting. So there's a couple of really important points. I think the first is that until there's a treatment, it's really hard to engage people around the idea of monitoring of cognitive health, right? Because what action do I take with that with that information? So I think the launch of treatments over the last couple of years really changes the environment in which we work. Now, there's, the first generation drugs, right? There's some complexities to those treatments. They're monthly or bi-weekly infusions. They're, you got to get in, so you physically got to present, you got to sit there for an infusion. There's some risks associated with them. So we're not quite at the, at the stage of, take a pill once a day and, make sure you monitor how you're going. But nonetheless, we're moving towards that. And so that really changes things. And, the work we've done in terms of sort of community research and things like that indicates to us that the people are interested in understanding their brain health. They are worried about their memory. As they age, people worry about their memory. And when you ask them, would you track it? Most say yes. But interestingly, what we've found is most would like to be able to track that outside of the context of their primary care physician. I just like to know what's going on. And then once you tell me, I can go into my doctor and have that validated. But most of them say they'd like to know. So And the point is we can do this now. Like, we can put apps on phones. We can have Siri read you a list of words and ask you to remember them and see whether you can. And we can make assessments about that. It's easy. The technology exists and the science supporting that exists. What we haven't sort of worked out, and when I say we, I mean the industry, not just Cogstate, is how do we how do you go from this is possible to this is happening at scale? And I think that's something that as a community we have to work through. We still struck a little bit by there is a portion of the population who say, I'd rather not know if something is going wrong. And I think, so there's education pieces around, but there's things you can do. You don't have to just put up with this in silence and just wait for the inevitable decline. There's treatments, there's lifestyle changes you can make, and at the very least, there's plans you can put in place, right? To make sure that that everyone talks a lot about lifespan, and I think there's this should be much more focus on health span. So what am I doing to make sure I get the maximum out of whatever years I've got? And and I think a key part of that is identification of problems, because people think still that I get older and my memory is going to get worse. It's just not true. It only happens if there's something happening inside your brain.
Yep.
We're involved in a whole bunch of research studies, and what we find is that we have these sort of super healthy ages, and they're fine. They're mentally really sharp, right? So it's not even in debate as to it happens because there's some sort of neurological change going on, and the earlier we can identify that, then the hope is the earlier we can treat it. And that's 100% where the pharma industry is going in Alzheimer's disease. So we're involved in trials of early Alzheimer's disease, which is people who have presence of biomarkers in the brain. So they've got these plaques and things that build up in their brain that impact the function of their brain, and they've got memory impairment. So we're involved in those kind of trials, and that's the drugs that have been approved now, which try and sort of remove those plaques from the brain with the idea that. And it's really not about making you better at the moment. It's about slowing the rate of decline, right? Which is still good, right? And if you're going to give me an extra 18 months or 2 years of thinking well, I'll take that versus the alternative, right? But we're going to see that gets better. And what the pharma companies are doing now is they're focused on what we call secondary prevention. So that's where people have the biomarker present. So we've got the start of this buildup of plaques in the brain, but they don't yet have the memory impairment. And so there's trials that we're running now with companies like ASI and companies like Lilly, where they're seeking to reduce those plaques in the brain before the memory impairment takes hold and maintain the person at that level. And so that's really exciting. And they'll read out within the next couple of years. And if that happens, the size of the Alzheimer's disease market just explodes, right? Because now we're talking about managing it like we manage cholesterol, right? As opposed to managing heart disease, we're managing your cholesterol levels so you don't get heart disease. It's the same thing. We're managing your plaque levels, so hopefully you don't end up with dementia. And I just find that incredibly exciting. But the key to it is early identification of disease. So that's more use of biomarkers, and more use of cognitive assessments to understand what's happening in that person. On the biomarker front, we just in May, the FDA approved the first ever treatment of, the first ever biomarker, so a blood-based test that will measure the amount of plaques that people have in their brain. And that's a complete game changer. Right? Because now we can know what's happening in your brain just by taking blood. Previously, we had to put you in a scanner, and do a PET scan and things like that. So doing that with blood makes it, it means we can industrialize that. It can flow into the healthcare system. And then I think the other aspect of that is that the cost of, 'cause we're an aging society, right? So what, and we can't just, you know, let everyone get sick and treat that sickness. What we want to do is keep people healthier so that we can reduce, healthcare costs, because otherwise the tax burden on our kids,
Sure.
it's just, goes through the roof. So we have to, so all of this makes sense. And the only thing that's missing is this early measurement of cognition.
Yeah, but it also sounds like what you're describing is almost a perfect storm that creates the disruption, where there's enough science to help us understand the origins of the hereditary components or the genetic components of this. Now there's testing that makes it easier and less expensive to determine whether you're having cognitive decline. There are medications to help treat you if you do have decline, which, as you said, makes people interested in doing the test for the first time because there's something they can do about it if they get the answer that they're not excited about.
Yeah.
So you put all these things together, and you could really hit that hockey stick moment for technologies like Cogstate's created to become much more even consumer facing, much more readily available for people to use in order
Yep.
to measure this in their
Yep.
own homes, if you
Yeah.
will, right?
Absolutely. And then there's a role for the technology to play in the community, in the context of clinical trials still as well, because when we, with the first drugs approved, we're already seeing an increase in R&D spend in Alzheimer's disease, so more trials, and the trials are going earlier in the disease state. And the problem is you got to find these patients. And so, so the ability, the beauty of an app is, social media targeted advertising, pushing to an app into the community where we can geo locate you. We can direct you to a clinical trial site that, where you may be interested. The demand for patients is going to be so high. And so there's a role to play just in even developing the next generation of drugs.
Yeah. It's interesting, I was thinking, my phone recognizes if I fall,
Yep.
right? Or if I'm in a car crash, or even if my sleep pattern has changed a little bit too much over the last week. How much longer before my phone just tells me, you're entering your passcode significantly more slowly than you did a month ago? Maybe it's cognitive decline. And, before it sort of becomes an automatic flow of just what you do in your daily activity, that there's a signal here that you should pay more attention to. I mean,
Uh,
is that something that's gonna just really make this easy, and in the normal course of life, we'll find out that we're declining?
I think it's going to be a really important, sort of way of identifying risk, right? So I think all of these passive measures, because what you're talking about is passive measures, where we're just monitoring in the background and we're noticing changes in behavior. We don't really know the reason, but there seems to be something different that's going on. Um, I think I think there's absolutely a role, for AI to play in a sort of, a large model there, in terms of putting together, what are those meaningful changes that provide risk, that point to risk you know, that warrants follow up. So the idea of having, your phone or your watch or whatever it is, monitoring a whole bunch of things and saying, something's wrong. Why don't you take this cognitive test?
Yeah.
So again, you can control it all, right? And then depending on the outcome, the advice may be as simple as, why don't you go see your doctor? Talk about this.
Yeah. So it's maybe a early detection trigger that then
100%.
steers you into the more comprehensive
Yeah.
testing that.
Yeah. So when we look at these, I mentioned these secondary prevention trials before, which is this, you've got the plaques, but you don't have the cognitive impairment. The way we look at, determining, the outcome of those trials is time to event. So where the event is cognitive impairment, right? So we're trying to build these models, predictive models of, based on where you are now, we're predicting
Yeah.
2 years,
Mhm.
4 years, 10 years, right? Because what we know about, Alzheimer's disease and dementia generally is, the triggers for it start 20 years before the symptoms
Right.
arrive. Right?
Yeah. And so maybe in this vein, like we're talking about automatic detection. We're talking about AI. You talked about this pretty complex services model where somebody has to read the data, somebody else reads it again, a third person breaks the tie potentially. So one of the things that we're working on together that I think we're both really excited about for the future is how do we convert some of that interpretation into AI?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. And it's really, how do you take, as opposed to large language models, how do we take small models of, thousands of clinical trial assessments where because we've got all these recordings of patients and clinicians and understanding, how they operate, and how do we take that to develop advanced analytics just in terms of error detection, and ultimately, in an ideal world, what we'd be seeking to do is, rather than identify error after the fact, is, to see it coming in real time so that we don't end up with that data error, in our database.
Right, because one of the big costs comes from inconsistency in the way that the test is administered or mistakes being made along the way that then could turn out to be a whole data value that's thrown out in the end, right?
Which is what happens now, right? So when we identify error, we remediate with the physician and say, let's not make this. But the error's in the first data point. That's there. Now, whether that's meaningful error or not, but it's there. And so in an ideal world, we've got the Medidata recovery device sitting in the middle of the table listening to us. We build the intelligence into that system so that, the recovery device is alerting to the doctor to an error, right? And we prevent it from happening.
Yep. So this would turn out to be a big disruption to the industry in terms of cost and availability to run these.
It's going to be interesting to see whether we can prove this out. But in an ideal world, because the signals in CNS trials are generally quite small, right? And so we have to design these really large trials to get your power, right? So how to get my P under 0.05 kind of thing, is you just add N to it, right? In phase 3 Alzheimer's disease trial might be 3,500 patients, right? And they're really hard to find, costs a lot of money. And so I think the question is, if we reduce error, can we improve signal strength to such an extent that we can reduce the size of the trial? Right, so that's what disruption looks like. If you get away from the practicality, what does this mean for my customer? Right? Can I run my phase 2 trial with 300 patients instead of 500 patients? Right? Which means I'm into my phase, because the recruitment is the longest part of your Alzheimer's disease trial. So So I'm recruiting less, therefore I'm reading out quicker. And then can my phase 3, rather than be 3,500 patients, could it be 2,500 patients, right? And can I have a greater signal strength on that, that facilitates that? And I think that's the question that we want to be able to answer.
And I think in the context of a CNS market in general, that is, by all expectations, is going to grow dramatically over the next few years. Maybe first of all, why is that? Like, why is there such huge expected growth in the CNS space? And then, of course, bringing these costs down to make those trials more affordable to run it becomes paramount.
I think there's probably a couple of factors in terms of CNS growth. I think the first is we're just getting much better at keeping people alive, right? So it comes to this health span versus lifespan stuff, right? And so, if once you're not dying of heart disease, the focus on the neurological disorders becomes a lot stronger. But I think probably the compelling reason is the advent of biomarkers, our ability to understand what's happening inside the brain. Before we were just guessing. Now so we didn't understand mechanisms of action in Alzheimer's disease a lot before. If we go back to, so solanezumab is one of the sort of highest profile failures of a phase 3 Alzheimer's disease trial. The post hoc analysis, and at the time that trial was designed and conducted, we didn't have the ability to measure amyloid plaques in the brain. The post hoc analysis showed us that something like 30% of the patients enrolled in that trial didn't have amyloid. So you're giving them an amyloid-reducing drug to people who don't have amyloid, right? No wonder the trial's not successful, right? So it's been the advent of these biomarkers that allow us to understand what's happening that means that the investment becomes less risky. So if you're a pharma executive and you've got multiple, programs, you've got to decide which you're going to invest in. Every company, from Cogstate through to Medidata through to Eli Lilly has to have prioritization discussions, right?
Sure.
This Hunger Game of ideas of, where only the strongest survive. And the question is, if you don't understand what's happening, it's really hard to, running an Alzheimer's disease phase 3 trial, you're probably dropping $1 billion or something. Right? It's a big investment if you don't know what's going on, right? So now that we've got more confidence, so we understand what's happening, we can make more informed decisions. And then as we're making these more informed decisions, we have better idea of what's actually happening and the mechanisms of action, we're seeing greater success levels. So as the success ramps up, right, then the R&D ramps up. So, you can look at a whole bunch of different industry analyst reports about this stuff, but, there's a number who believe that that central nervous system diseases will begin to approach oncology in terms of size of R&D spend over the course of the next sort of 10, 20 years. And certainly that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a huge increase in whether it's Alzheimer's disease or rare diseases. So the number of rare disease trials that are going on at the moment, with their central nervous system disease focus. The CRISPR stuff around gene editing. It's just amazing.
It's amazing. Yeah. And I think, Cogstate's really nicely positioned sitting at the middle of this explosion. So, we like to wrap up these podcasts usually with a call to action for our listeners who, as you know, are kind of all over the map. We've got pharma, we've got CROs, we've got investors. So if you want to maybe sum this all up, you're a tax guy who went in as a temp employee to a company going public worth like $20 and going public. You became CEO. 20 years later, the dream pivoted, became a disruption, has more potential for disruption in the future as this becomes more and more commercial and maybe even targeted directly to consumers. I mean, there's a lot we packed in there in the last few minutes. Sum it all up in a call to action for our industry, maybe, or however you want to frame it. But what do you want to leave people with in terms of what they should do?
Yeah. So I'll frame it in the context which I get, quite often, which is you've been doing this for 20 years. Do you still find this exciting? Like, what do you, how long are you going to do this for? And my answer to that is that it's never been more exciting. Like, I think, and I think this is true of startups, but it's true of different indications and drug classes as we think. The first however many years is just such a hard slog, right? Everything's really hard and no one really knows what they're doing. We're at a stage now in central nervous system disease where we've got such an understanding now of what's happening and the ability now to use technology to make the conduct of trials easier, to be able to take those trials into a broader section of the community, right? So get greater diversity in terms of patient population because we can use technology to better train site staff to be able to conduct these trials. We can do it with less error. We can understand mechanism of action better. We can we can fast forward these trials so we can spend less to improve our health outcomes. And then with the ability to put tools in the hands of consumers, it's just so exciting. Like, what else would you be doing? Saving people from paying tax?
Well, I think you're definitely in the right role. Definitely in the right role. So, Brad, Thanks a lot for being here today. I think this is a great conversation. We're certainly excited about our partnership with Cogstate, and I can't wait to see what this business does in the future as consumers become more and more able to do these tests themselves and measure their own and their families' cognitive decline.
Thanks for having me.